Hello and welcome to Backwards Compatible, a show that critiques games of the past in long form. This video is the third in a many-part series where I'll examine the Uncharted franchise of games created by developer Naughty Dog. In this video, I will be examining in excruciating detail Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception, and if you haven't played Uncharted 3, I would suggest that you do so before you begin watching this video, as I will be spoiling every plot point. I also suggest you watch my previous videos on Uncharted 1 and Uncharted 2, as I will be referencing criticisms I made in those videos. Without any more said, let's begin.
All men dream, but not equally. Those who dream by night, in the dusty recesses of their minds, wake in the day to find that it was vanity. But the dreamers of the day are dangerous men, for they may act their dream with open eyes to make it possible. This I did.
Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception released in October of 2011 for the PlayStation 3, once again just 2 years after Uncharted 2. Unlike Uncharted 2, however, there was a bit of a cloud over Uncharted 3. Many fears that the game had been rushed to meet the 2-year deadline. I'm going to be talking a lot about this during the video, but I want to state now that I try the best I can to separate everything outside the game from everything inside the game. That means if a game has launch issues, bugs, or graphical issues in frame rate, etc., I don't expect to go into that in too much detail. In my Uncharted 1 review, I never even mentioned the bad controls, especially with the grenade throwing, because the version I think most people are going to play going forward will be the one in the Uncharted collection. The reality is that I hope to look at the best version of the game that exists. In my opinion, there are reviews that are for the launch version of games. Backwards Compatible is about what's available to everyone today. As before, I'm going to talk through the entire game and stop and talk about issues as they become relevant. We begin in a bit of a different setting from the Uncharted games, in a real lived-in city, London. Nate and Sully are all dressed up and enter a pub. It seems like a deal is about to go down, and sure enough, a man with a British accent, Talbot, pulls out a briefcase of money. It turns out it's for Nate's ring, the one that's been significant in prior games, allegedly an heirloom of explorer Francis Drake, whom Nathan claims is his ancestor. It will be an essential item in this game, but more on that later. The deal goes south when Sully proclaims the money is fake, and a fight breaks out. This is when Naughty Dog would like to show off its fancy new combat mechanics. Nate can now punch, counterattack, throw enemies, and break from holds. It seems like a lot, but it actually is still pretty shallow. What is cool is the spectacle of it all. Transitions from Nate punching one enemy to kicking another, and then tossing someone else is all relatively smooth. And there is some awesome contextual environment stuff. Nate will grab a bottle or something from the bar and smash it against an enemy. It makes for a nice show, but it lacks depth. Uncharted has never been about unarmed combat, so I've never really addressed it before, but this game goes out of its way to put the player in a couple scenarios that are unarmed only. It doesn't really work for me, partly because I don't believe that any of these fine gentlemen don't have guns, but also because I just don't think the setup works. It's Nathan and Sully versus everyone in this bar. They could easily all just dive on them and this part would be over in no time flat, but for some reason everyone waits to give Nathan a fighting chance. Eventually Nate ends up in a fight with a larger man meant to be some kind of unarmed mini-boss, and you are able to overcome him with some difficulty. Nate and Sully leave the bar to be confronted at gunpoint by Talbot and a man named Charlie Cutter. We are introduced very early on to our main antagonists, Marlowe, an older British lady with a sense of mystery about her. This is partly because her, Sully, and Drake seem to have some history.
Should have known you'd be behind this. Oh, careful now. Wouldn't want you to melt.
Same cocky little shit. So fearless. I wonder what you're really afraid of. Not bullets or blood or broken bones. No. You get off on all this, don't you? Cheating death.
Regardless, she takes Nate's prized ring and is about to leave when Cutter overreacts and shoots both Nate and Sully, presumed dead. Given that it's a populated area, Marlowe and her men must leave quickly. The camera pans to Drake and then cuts to a flashback. This flashback takes us way back to when Nathan Drake was a kid living in some South American city. It's quite an unusual thing to see in a video game, a flashback to a character's origin, one that's playable. At most, I feel that games will show us a quick movie of a significant moment, but shy away from anything too long. This is where Naughty Dog shows their storytelling prowess. We get to see a side of Drake that we never really thought about before. He's not some American-raised golden boy. He's a street urchin, far more Aladdin than he is Indiana Jones. It's a side many developers have never shown about their characters. If you want to play a fun game, try to think of a time in a game where you played as the kid version of one of the main characters. I'm not saying this is anything groundbreaking, but it does help color the story in an interesting way. Nathan Drake wasn't always a charismatic adventurer he is today. So, what happens during this flashback? Well, young Drake enters a museum dedicated to his alleged forefather Francis Drake, clearly looking for something specific. He then finds the ring that says greatness from small beginnings that we know he will eventually obtain. He jots down a couple notes when a much younger Sullivan enters the scene and seems to be after the same thing. It appears they aren't acquainted quite yet. Young Drake then follows Sullivan from the rooftops of the city, and then tries to steal the key Sullivan is making. This is how they meet.
Suelta me, viejo!
Let's try that again.
Let go of me.
Ah, that's what I thought. Now don't try to run.
Later on that night, Drake goes to steal the ring and is confronted by Sullivan and Marlowe. Apparently this is not only the origin story of Nathan and Sully, but the origin story of this whole adventure in a way. With the ring is also some kind of cipher disk that will be important later, but as Marlowe shows she is willing to get messy to get what she wants, Drake attempts to escape, jumping on rooftops to elude Marlowe's men. It's a fun chase sequence, but it suffers a little bit from the fact that enemies seemingly pop up from nowhere once again. It ends with Sully trying to save Drake, and the two chat over food, and we come to realize a lot more about Nathan and how the two will be inseparable from here on out.
On his way around the world, Drake sailed through the East Indies. Only he says that it took him 6 months to get from here to here.
Yeah, so?
So it doesn't add up. He was way too good a sailor for that. It would have taken him a month, tops. He was hiding something. Something big.
How big?
Like secret mission from the Queen big. Like millions in plundered treasure that hasn't ever been recovered big.
That big?
That big.
And that decoder has something to do with it?
I would bet my life on it.
My friends call me Sully.
Nathan Drake. Nate.
Drake, huh? Okay. I see great things in our future, kid. Great things.
We rejoin our allegedly dead heroes in the modern world, and once the bad guys are out of sight, it's revealed that it was a ruse all along, and that Cutter was an inside man. Drake even managed to keep his own special ring. Sully, Drake, and Cutter now join with Chloe from the last Uncharted game to track down Marlowe. I enjoy the addition of Cutter to the team. It's fairly apparent that he is a person that has more defined flaws, which is a nice contrast to the other main characters who don't seem to have anything that will slow them down. Cutter is slightly claustrophobic and a bit more aloof. Chloe is still strong, but it seems like she got a card in the mail that said, "Hey, you aren't a big character in this game, so tone it down a little bit." Because while her performance is fine, she definitely plays the scenes far more low-key, almost in the background. Eventually the group enter a series of secret tunnels to some kind of hidden facility that Marlowe has set up. This all leads to Sully, Cutter, and Drake eavesdropping on our antagonists. Marlowe finds out very soon that the ring she stole earlier from Drake is a forgery. Apparently Drake was able to pull the rug out from under her. This scene unfortunately highlights a major plot hole of the game, but I want to talk about that later. And just so we are all clear, I might be saying that phrase a lot because there will be a better time to talk about the story more toward the end of the video instead of piecemealing it all over the place, so let's move on for now. Marlowe and Talbot leave the room and give Drake and friends a moment to explore and also use the cipher disk with the correct ring. He uses it to find a clue in the figurehead of Sir Francis Drake's old boat, and they have their next location. Right away you'll notice some differences. Firstly is how combat sounds and feels better. Clearly additional time was put into the sound design of the guns. They no longer sound like wimpy pea shooters. And also force feedback from the controller, which I can't believe I'm commenting on since I usually don't care about that kind of thing, is much improved. Drake can also throw grenades back, which is just tricky enough to still matter. The enemies this time around are Marlowe's thugs, which pride themselves in apparently dressing up to work, complete with a suit and tie, but other than that you won't notice much difference to how they behave versus how enemies in the past games have behaved. I'm sorry, I'll sound like a broken record by saying this, but I'll have more on that later in the video. Our heroes manage to escape the underground and proceed to have a meeting. They figure out that the treasure has to deal with something called the Atlantis of the Sands, a mystery that involved both Lawrence of Arabia and someone simply named John Dee, on some kind of mission for the Queen at the time. Drake proposes that they must find the grave of two knights, one in France and one in Syria, so they decide to split up. Sully and Drake will proceed to France, Chloe and Cutter will head to Syria. We of course follow Drake and Sully to France first. The environment here is an old wooden French chateau surrounded by woods on all sides. It's been abandoned for quite some time and makes for a good playground for Drake to climb all over. They say that they need to get to an older part of the structure where the knight may be buried. At this point, I was expecting something akin to the section in Uncharted 2 with Tenzin, a long sequence of climbing and traversal to get to the tomb. After all, I had no reason to expect combat, with Drake saying,
Drake only had half the clues. Lawrence only had half. We have both. And Marlowe has nothing.
implying we were far ahead of the enemy, and they would have to play catch up. Unfortunately, I was disappointed to come upon Marlowe's fashionably dressed soldiers so early on. Nate says some dialogue,
They must have followed us.
and that seems to make it okay that they seem to be the first ones here. As I've said a lot, I'll return to this later, but for now, Nate must fight his way through several of Marlowe's men to get to a tower where his goal is. Once there, he and Sully descend into the underground and come upon a puzzle. And it's here I must apologize. In my last video I said, I think the puzzles in Uncharted 4 finally accomplished this balance. Which isn't 100% true. Actually, Uncharted 3 makes puzzles, well, puzzling again. It's by no means difficult to figure out, but for the first time in the series, the game presents an actual puzzle that goes beyond looking at your book and implementing the solution. The worst kind of puzzle is one where you already know the solution, and it takes painstakingly long to implement that solution. And thankfully, none of the puzzles in Uncharted 3 are like that, whereas Uncharted 2 had several of those. This tower in France has two puzzles. One that simply has you walk a path, think Last Crusade, but unfortunately without the death pit if Drake missteps, and the other has you put symbols on a grid that must be next to other symbols. Half the solution is in your book, the other half is located in the environment, so it's not straightforward. Solving both of these puzzles will bring Drake to the knight's grave and one half of the amulet that gives him the next clue. Nate does a charcoal rubbing of the amulet, because I guess he doesn't have a smartphone or camera on him yet, and he and Sully exit only to be confronted by Talbot, only one step behind. Drake is forced to give up the amulet when something unpredictable happens. Giant spiders swarm the group. Talbot gets away, and Sully and Drake must run for their lives. Let's address the spiders really quickly. I'm not terrified of spiders. If one's around me or on me, I'll panic, but otherwise I don't get too irrationally scared. That said, these things freak me out. The way they move and spawn is awesome, and I have to imagine it was very difficult to implement. It's one of those things that reminds me of the scarabs from the Mummy movies or the ants from that one Indiana Jones film that no one wants to talk about. They are threatening while being nothing like a standard enemy, and they add an element of mystery to the game. I also like how they are sort of foreshadowed, by the jar in Marlowe's lab, by the body at the top of the tower, and the spiderwebs everywhere, which you'll see in the next location with spiders. Anyway, moving on. Sully and Drake escape the swarm only to be confronted by more of Marlowe's men who are preparing to burn the place down. I won't knock it, it's an incredible sequence where you get to fight through a crumbling mansion on fire as you try to escape. I had the pleasure of playing this sequence in 3D once, and I can tell you it's incredibly well done, as is much of the game in 3D, but I particularly enjoyed this sequence. Eventually, Nate and Sully escape as the tower crumbles behind you, and you are able to leap to safety just in time. They surmise that since they were followed, so must Cutter and Chloe, so they head off to Syria next.
What?
Cutter and Chloe. Sully, if we were followed,
Shit, chances are they were too.
we gotta warn them.
Yeah, and get to Syria fast.
They arrive at a Syrian Museum of sorts, very reminiscent of the Turkish museum in Uncharted 2. Sully and Drake enter to once again find Marlowe's men already at the scene. And once again, it's not a small group either. It's several of them, armed to the teeth. After fighting your way through a lot of combat, you come upon Chloe and Cutter. Earlier Nate had presumed them captured, but it turns out that they are just fine, and give the worst excuses one could think of in a narrative.
We've been trying to reach you for over 24 hours.
Oh, right, I need to top up my minutes.
You're using a prepaid phone?
Mate, those contracts are a complete rip-off.
What? Mine's broken.
Again?
Look, just forget all that. You'll never guess what we've discovered.
So, with the four of you together, you search for the next knight's tomb. Cutter has actually found a clue that might lead the right way, so you follow it. The Syrian Museum is a lot of combat, and not a lot of much else. To be fair, it's some of the better combat in the game. There's even a section I really enjoyed that lets you complete it with all stealth. Doing so has the reward of preventing more soldiers from spawning in, something that I think should be in the game more than it is. There's a moment when Nate and his friends are climbing a tower, it seems like it's always a tower, isn't it? Where Drake is forced outside the tower and, for a change, has to do some vertical shooting. It's a cool moment, working to combine the game's climbing mechanics with the game's combat, something that had been severely lacking in past entries. Uncharted 3 definitely works to remedy that, albeit only slightly. Nate then comes upon a larger than average man meant to be a hand-to-hand combat boss. And while the camera tries to force you to beat him that way, it's nice that you have the option to use your guns instead. Skipping forward a bit, eventually you get to a series of columns which might house the entrance to the tomb Drake and team are looking for. It's here that one of the most infamous moments of Uncharted 3 occurs. I'll talk briefly about it here, but I want to reiterate that I'm going to be talking at greater length about the story later. Talbot appears and shoots Cutter with some kind of dart, while Drake, Chloe, and Sully are around a corner. He whispers, "Don't trust Drake," to Cutter, and then steals the journal. Drake, Chloe, and Sully then see him back away and go around a corner, and when they turn the corner, he is gone. How? How on earth did he just disappear? Maybe we will find out later. For now, we are left with a drugged Cutter that is forced down some narrow passages on the way to the next tomb. This eventually culminates in Drake and Cutter locked in a brawl, with Cutter almost killing Nate. The delusion breaks just in time, however, and they proceed on as normal. Nothing really changes, and you're left to wonder why that scene was ever in the story. Once again, the group are deep underground in some kind of puzzle room. There are more spiders down here, and Cutter and Drake decide that they need to get to a water source in order to get a mechanism working. Why is Cutter chosen for this? Beats me. Chloe would surely be a better choice given the recent happenings, but like I said, Naughty Dog are actively trying to make Chloe not a character in this game. Nathan throws some torches to some light braziers, avoids the spiders, and gets the water running, and then he has to move a globe into position. It's not so much a puzzle as it is a piece of eye candy, but it's nice nonetheless. This activates the route to the inner tomb and the next half of the amulet. Cutter decides that he wants to take it from Drake because he lost the last one. Again, given recent circumstances, this makes no sense.
Thank you very much.
Nicely done.
Yeah, all the same. I think I'll hold on to this one.
All right, let's get the hell out of here.
If anyone, it should be given to Chloe or Sully. Anyone but Cutter. But like the moment where Drake handed the journal to Sully in Uncharted 1, we can surmise this is going to set up some kind of forced story moment. And it does. Fast forwarding ahead, the group finds their way outside and is confronted by Talbot and men. Cue infamous scene number 2. Talbot says a trigger word and Cutter becomes under mind control once again, only to be faking it. After the group have dropped their guns, Cutter shoots Talbot square in the chest, and the group runs for it. After a bit, they have to jump off a tower, but Cutter is left behind. The bad guys catch up, and Marlowe and somehow Talbot is among them, looking just fine. The amulet is stolen from Cutter, and this is exactly why Cutter has the amulet, and is left behind to be burned alive. But he is able to jump off the tower, and he breaks his legs in the fall. Sully begins to carry Cutter to safety as you make your way out of the museum. Our heroes recap their adventures so far, the gist of which is that Cutter is out of commission, Chloe thinks the stakes are too high, and Sully will follow whatever Drake wants to do. And Drake wants to continue, which will require a friend's help as they travel to Yemen next. So, I want to pause here because the video has been mostly story recaps so far, and I don't like that. Very soon in the video I will be talking about story and other things, but we need to get just a bit farther before that. I do want to address something right now though. So, I have made videos for Uncharted Drake's Fortune and Uncharted 2 Among Thieves, which I suggest you check out, but what I want to say now is that we have a good sample size of games to talk about. To keep it simple, Uncharted 1 does many things wrong, Uncharted 2 fixed many of those problems, and is a very well made game. Now with Uncharted 3, I think we can finally talk at length about some of the series' tropes, and whether or not they have evolved or are still problematic. So, climbing. It's probably one of the biggest complaints I hear about the Uncharted franchise. The climbing is boring. I see that. There's little to no choice involved, one playthrough can almost look identical to another because it's all more or less one path. The way Naughty Dog changed this up sometimes is by having some collapsing handholds and the like, which is something I'm not a big fan of. The allure to climbing comes in two forms. It aids pacing between fights, and it allows you to take in the environment, perhaps helping you to feel like an adventurer. Whether or not it accomplishes those for you is going to be up to each individual person. Personally, I think climbing gets a bad rap. It's not meant to be the core of the game. It hasn't really changed since Uncharted 1, the most you could say that it is now more used in combat environments, but there are still moments of pure traversal in Uncharted 3 that don't do anything special. The ideal way to develop climbing further is to make it more free so you can take multiple paths to a destination. The other major addition would be to add tools to aid climbing, which Uncharted 4 does with the grappling hook, so I don't think I need to say more. The climbing is what it is. It's not the best, but I think people overlook how linear other games are with climbing, though in a less obvious way. Once again, let's talk about combat. Combat improved greatly from Uncharted 1 to 2, but is more or less the same in Uncharted 3. I previously mentioned that there was an improvement in Uncharted 3 with the ability to throw back a grenade, but that's really it. But what are the issues that have persisted through all three games? Enemy AI has been a persistent problem. There are a few different types of enemies in Uncharted. Some hide behind cover and will move occasionally, others will charge you with shotguns, and a variety in between. This keeps you on your feet, but it also highlights a huge problem where you are constantly rushed by enemies. As one man doing all the work, it can feel like you're being faced with an entire army. And they all rush at you with almost zero sense of self-preservation. That happens in many games, but combine that with the other major issue, the fact that enemies rarely miss, and it can be easy to get stuck scrambling for ammo. As an aside, when Drake is hurt, the games go black and white, which makes it hard to enjoy the environment. I suppose it's good motivation to avoid getting hit, but there are some situations in the game where you have to be hit. There is no choice. With most deaths occurring as a result of being rushed in the middle of combat and scrambling to get a new weapon when low on ammo, it seems that many of combat's problems stem from just how many enemies Drake goes up against in a single encounter. There are so many that I think it purposely obstructs the fact that the AI isn't really that good at all. Just that facing overwhelming numbers is where the challenge comes from. I've played these games on hard and some encounters feel fine, some encounters feel cheap, but I don't think I would ever want to play on crushing. If you do, fine, but I think the game's difficulty comes from artificiality at that point. Drake has next to no health while some enemies are absolute bullet sponges. To me, the game's combat shouldn't be reliant on excessive numbers because that begins to break the world. I've mentioned before how in Uncharted 1 enemies would absolutely flood an arena. This happens again in Uncharted 3 to an alarming degree. It begins to become less and less believable each time it occurs. I've said before that I enjoy combat, and I still do. But I do believe Uncharted 3 showcases some of its biggest flaws. I'll get to one of them in a bit. The third tentpole of Uncharted would probably be the story, but I'm gonna hold off on that for just a little bit longer. You'll see why. Let's return now to the story at hand with Drake and Sully off to Yemen. They arrive in Yemen to pick up the trail courtesy of Elena Fisher once again, who has some kind of press badge to the city. I want to point out that this is another coincidence. She's in the one city they need access to, but I want to propose a different situation. Uncharted 1, 2, and 3 may be less the story of Nate's adventures and more the story of adventures that involve Elena. So, while her involvement is sometimes coincidental, one could prefer to think of it as the reason we are seeing these particular adventures is because she was somehow involved. There are many off-screen adventures that Nate and Sully often refer to that don't have games made about them, so I like this explanation. We are essentially seeing how adventure and their relationships tie together. I'm on a bit of a tangent, so back to it. Sully, Elena, and Nate head into the city, apparently looking for an older part of the city. On the way, Nathan happens upon Talbot and attempts to get the journal back. He is able to do so, stealing it from Talbot, and is then forced into a hand-to-hand combat section. It's visually impressive, but once again goes on for a little too long, requiring goons to constantly drop in from nowhere. None of these people have guns though, for some reason, so Drake is able to escape. They run down this path here and magically they are where they need to be. Your eyes might roll out of your head for this one.
All right, just tell me what you're really looking for.
This? Come here. Sully, check this out.
I think we lost him. What do you got?
It looks like we stumbled right into our secret entrance.
Well, that's our girl.
I suppose I should mention that while all this is going on, there is a subplot happening with Nate and Elena. Apparently, it is implied that they were engaged or even married at some point, but it was broken off for one reason or another. They heavily hint at some awkwardness between them, but Elena tries to play it professional, even though it's clear she disapproves of the situation Drake is in. It all culminates in one simple exchange.
Led to this. And this led us here.
To a hole in the ground.
Oh, it's a glamorous life. Come on, admit it. You love all this as much as I do.
No. No, not anymore.
Really? Huh. Okay, well, why don't you just, walk away?
Oh, me? Me walk away. That's funny.
Yet, Elena sticks around. It's clear they still have feelings for each other, and it matters a lot to Elena that Nate doesn't get himself killed. They proceed down a well to the next underground hidden temple. This one contains two puzzles that are, once again, actually puzzles. I especially like this one where Nate has to use forced perspective to make this contraption work. This leads to a room with some kind of astral projector that projects stars onto the ceiling. This supposedly shows the way to the Lost City, and Drake asks Sully to memorize it instead of writing it down so it can't be stolen. This is both genius and stupid. Genius because Drake has finally figured out to stop writing down clues so the bad guys can't steal them. Stupid because I'm not sure it's possible to memorize a star pattern on a ceiling in less than 5 minutes. I'll give it to Naughty Dog though. According to my research, you actually can figure out a place on Earth within a few miles given a star chart on the above sky. So, whatever, maybe Sully has incredible memorization skills. Once again, spiders attack, and this time they are a bit more aggressive, which forces Nate to shoot them off. The door is stuck on the other side, and although Drake clearly has enough room to fit under it, he instead has to shoot back the swarm. This makes the swarm go from a sinister environmental hazard to a standard video game enemy that you can shoot off to repel, in my opinion depleting a lot of their intrigue. On the way out, the group are ambushed by more of Marlowe's thugs. Nothing special here. Moving on to the group back out on the streets where Nathan is shot by the same dart that affected Cutter earlier, sending him into a trippy sequence where he moves throughout the city as it bends and twists. Once again, I must say that I don't know a great deal about how hard things are to implement in video games, but this sequence seems very technically impressive to me. It's very disorienting, though the one later in the game is definitely far better. Eventually, Nate wakes from his drugged stupor to discover he's been captured by Marlowe and Talbot. Drake is defenseless, and it appears he has been for quite some time. Apparently, while drugged, Nathan has divulged the fact that Sully has the key to finding the lost city Marlowe is looking for. Marlowe and Nate share a conversation that shows she knows more about him than we were led to believe, and we get a short glimpse into some of Drake's secret past.
In fact, I suspect I know you better than anyone, Mr. Drake. Of course, that's not your real name, is it? But we won't dwell on that. Mother commits suicide. Father surrenders son to the state at the age of 5. Entrusted to the St. Francis Boys' Home. It's also Dickensian.
The conversation doesn't last long. Talbot proclaims they've captured Sullivan, and Drake creates a distraction and chases Talbot. This is a fairly long sequence that's satisfying to play. I don't think there's ever been a chase sequence quite like it. This also works to paint Talbot more as Drake's foil, able to climb and parkour just as good as he can. Stray too far behind and you'll lose Talbot, amusingly caught by some guards that are as good as running and jumping as you guys are. Drake is able to catch Talbot, but it's over fairly quickly. Drake once again getting knocked out. He wakes up on a pirate ship captured by a new character, and it's here that I finally want to talk about the story. Just before I do, keep in mind where Drake is. He is on some kind of derelict ship in a ship graveyard, and his captor says he has Sullivan. Drake eventually escapes and tries to find Sully, but it's not important. Uncharted 3 does many things as well as Uncharted 2. Before beginning this critique, I thought them more or less on par with each other. I don't anymore. That's because, to be as blunt as possible, Uncharted 3's story is a colossal mess. The game really starts to break apart at the seams once you analyze it even a little bit. Uncharted 1 was also a mess, but for different reasons, and I think Uncharted 2's story holds up to scrutiny. But the problems with Uncharted 3 are many, and they aren't just in one area. Let's start with the plot. The basic premise of the game is that Drake is racing Marlowe to find the lost city of Ubar, also known as Aram of the Pillars, also known as Atlantis of the Sands, etc. That's all well and good, but then there are many subplots stacked on top of this. Subplot 1, Drake's origin story as a treasure hunting adventurer and his tie with Sir Francis Drake. Subplot 2, the origin and relationship of Victor Sullivan and Nathan Drake and what they mean to each other. Subplot 3, Drake's estranged relationship with Elena and somewhat reconciling with her. Subplot 4, characters questioning Nathan Drake's drive, his utter focus to continue despite the cost or danger. Those are the major subplots, and the problem isn't that they are all in the game, it's that only one of them is handled well. The first, Drake's origin story, is barely there, but this game begins and centers around a ring he finds very important to him. It's mentioned several times, but it never goes anywhere. In fact, Nathan forgets a lesson he learned in Uncharted 1 by pushing forward when his ancestor held back. Drake and Elena also have something going on, but it's never clear what happened, and if you come directly from Uncharted 2 into 3, you might be rightfully confused, since the game ended on such a promising note. They just don't have that many scenes together to warrant a reunion at the end, at least from my perspective. The last bad subplot is the one about Nathan's drive despite the dangers, summed up when Chloe backs out after Syria.
You doing all right?
Oh, fabulous.
That was too close.
You'll be okay.
No, I mean the whole thing. Just isn't worth it, Nate. Let this one go.
Oh, no. You can't just give up. If you let these bastards win, after this, I will never bloody forgive you.
Don't you worry, Charlie. There's no way I'm letting them win.
What is it with you? What are you trying to prove?
I'm not trying to prove anything.
This one is given a couple throwaway lines at best, but Nate goes right on, getting himself nearly killed on many occasions. This one also speaks to the whole ludonarrative dissonance problem that Uncharted has. Drake has killed hundreds of people in the Uncharted games, and it doesn't faze him, which is supposed to be screwed up, but it's not really addressed. Except here, and one line in Uncharted 2.
You think I am a monster, but you're no different from me, Drake. How many men have you killed? How many just today?
The problem with addressing it is that Naughty Dog does nothing to fix it. The only thing we can do as players is to rationalize that, hey, it's a video game and video games need things to shoot at. And by inserting it into the narrative, it does nothing besides acknowledge the fact that it's a problem and Drake isn't gonna care. I'll probably have more on this in a future video, so I'll move on. The only subplot that worked for me was Sully and Nate's relationship. I do believe it was the core point of the game. I don't think Sir Francis Drake should have been in the game to focus more on their relationship, because I think it's a good one. Sully essentially saves Nate from street life, whether for good or for bad, and they are incredibly loyal to each other. Back in the game, Nathan's about to do some crazy things to save Sully. Those are the issues with the subplots. Let's talk about plot points that don't make sense. For starters, let's discuss Marlowe's organization. It's never given a name, but it's implied to be powerful and well-funded. How powerful? Well, not powerful enough to forge a ring that can fit in the cipher disk. Not even given 20 or so years are they ever able to do this. They are also unable to simply take the ring from Drake in the bar, because none of them have guns for some reason, and have to resort to buying it. Likewise, there is a scene later in Yemen where they outnumber Drake, who is unarmed, but once again none of them are carrying weapons. Why does this matter? Because it's impossible to gauge who we are dealing with as an enemy in the game, and it leads to a lot of dumb dialogue. Dialogue that's meant to cover for pitfalls in the narrative. Remember how Drake and Sully get to France and find Marlowe's men already there? It's explained by a throwaway bit of dialogue.
How the hell do you think they found us?
They must have followed us. It's the only way.
How? How were they followed? Were they able to track the flights, the car? Why is it so easy for this organization to track Nate, Sully, Cutter, and Chloe? It's never explained. Speaking of throwaway dialogue, there is a bunch in this game. It starts to seem clear that Naughty Dog added voice lines in an attempt to tie loose plot threads together. Why are Cutter and Chloe out of contact in Syria? You may rightfully assume they are captured, or this.
We've been trying to reach you for over 24 hours.
Oh, right, I need to top up my minutes.
You're using a prepaid phone?
Mate, those contracts are a complete rip-off.
What? Mine's broken.
Again?
So the reason our heroes are now in a life or death situation is because one person's phone is inexplicably broken and the other person needs to top up their minutes because they're being cheap. It's a dumb excuse. There's another one later in the game. Drake has just crossed the desert for days and happened upon an abandoned settlement. This is a place that Marlowe's people should have no business being at. This settlement has no significance in the story. It once again exists because too much time had passed since the last combat encounter. The reason the game gives for Marlowe's men being there?
They must have been sent to look for the plane.
Why? Why on earth would they be searching for the plane here? And if they are searching for the plane, why are they bringing heavily armed trucks? Then there is just lazy writing. How do Nathan, Elena, and Sully find the place in Yemen they are looking for? They stumble upon it.
This? Come here. Sully, check this out.
I think we lost him. What do you got?
It looks like we stumbled right into our secret entrance.
How does Talbot get the second half of the amulet? Cutter has it, even though he just tried to kill Drake. This leads me into why I chose this time in the game to talk about the story. Remember where we left off? If you don't, it's okay, because it doesn't matter. Drake is about to go through roughly a 2-hour piece of the game that has no significance to the plot. None. So let me reiterate what happens here. Drake is captured aboard some boat by pirates. He is told that the pirates have Sully. He is able to break free and jumps around the ship graveyard trying to find him, which eventually takes him onto this cruise ship. He goes down into the lower decks, finds a tied up Sullivan, but plot twist, it wasn't actually Sully, and the pirate lied. This leads to Nathan blowing up the ship to save his own skin. An entire cruise ship sinks, and Drake barely escapes. He luckily washes up on shore in Yemen, reunites with Elena, and they plan their next move. Everything I just mentioned can be cut from the game and the story wouldn't change one bit. It's a complete non sequitur. But the problems don't end there. Allow me to point out some of the other problems with this section of the game. Firstly, why? Why does this pirate have you captured? Why did Marlowe give you up to him? She very clearly wouldn't do that. At the very least, she would use Drake as collateral to motivate Sully. So that brings us back to why. The pirate, whose name is Ramses, wants to get to Iram too. That's once again a throwaway line of dialogue. There's nothing supporting that in this chapter. The pirates clearly don't have the resources. Besides, Ramsey knows that Marlowe actually has Sully, and he already knows that Drake has nothing. So what's the point? Even if you buy that excuse, after Drake begins shooting everyone under Ramsey's command, what reason does he have to continue the lie? He's losing men left and right, and all he has to say is, yeah, actually I don't have Sullivan. Drake otherwise has no quarrel with the pirates. It's manufactured. So manufactured that, get this, Ramses actually sets up a dummy Sullivan, even getting the correct shirt color in the hold of his cruise ship. So let's think about this for more than a couple seconds. Ramses wants to use Drake to get to Ubar, somehow. He motivates him by telling Drake he has Sully. Ramses then takes off in his cruise ship, practically assured that Drake wouldn't be able to follow, but sets up this dummy anyway? Why? To what purpose? To trap Drake? What is Drake worth to him? Absolutely nothing. The only one he's worth something to is Marlowe, and Marlowe didn't want him. Ramses ends up losing his entire cruise ship for no discernible reason. And Drake ends up back on the shore in Yemen, where he was before the ship graveyard, back with Elena, and none of the events are ever discussed again in the series. I know I have picked upon this part of the game a lot already, but here's why. Uncharted is a story-focused game. Players may enjoy the combat or enjoy the visuals, but I think most play for the adventures, the characters, and the plot, which usually involves ancient temples, traps, and supernatural elements of some kind. I think it's a complete failing then to have a part of the game that is so poorly executed narrative-wise, and one that doesn't connect to the rest of the story in any measurable way. It's representative of the rest of Uncharted 3's problems, a story that has too many holes in it to work. I haven't even gotten to the biggest one yet. I can only guess at the core issue, what caused so many story problems in Uncharted 3 versus Uncharted 2. My first guess is that they were under a time constraint and the story went through rewrites, many of which were unable to be reconciled by the game's launch. My second guess is that Naughty Dog actually has the ideas for the set piece or climax moments and then tries to fill in the story around it. For the ship graveyard and crew segments, I think it's a little bit of both camps, but I think rewrites and time constraints had a large share in the problem. Enter Talbot. Talbot is, for lack of a better term, a walking plot hole. There are 3 instances in the game where the logic of the game world breaks completely. 3 moments that cannot be rationalized within the context of the story in any way. The first is his disappearing act. Remember how I said we might find out later? We don't. No explanation is ever given. He just disappears and we the players are supposed to accept that and not question it. Ever since the game's released, many have tried to ask the developers what that was about, but the only explanation I could find was left up to the fact that Talbot's background is mysterious and may have to do with black ops or magic tricks. Some kind of escape wire then, except that makes no sense either. There's clearly no indication of a wire or a person disappearing from around this corner, and Talbot would have to set up some kind of contraption in order to make that work. Plain and simple, it's a plot hole, and worse, it's an obvious one that doesn't even get a throwaway line of dialogue to explain it. Talbot's second act is perhaps even more horrendous. During a standoff, Cutter shoots him square in the chest. Now, this has a complete rational explanation: body armor. Except that there's no bullet hole that Naughty Dog bothered to show, and you can see Talbot lying on the ground here motionless for a good while. If he was shot but it only hit his body armor, why would he play dead? The next cutscene in the game is clearly meant to frame the events in a mysterious way, and that Talbot was able to mysteriously survive the gunshot wound. Body armor is not given as an in-game explanation. Players are just meant to accept it and move on. This brings us to our last enigma, a tarot card hidden in Cutter's pocket after he falls, it depicting recent events. Once again, the game makes no comment on it after this scene. We are just meant to say, "Ooh, spooky," and move on, I suppose. But these three instances are blatant plot holes, ones that everyone playing this game is sure to discover and wonder how they made it into the final game. It's for this reason why it's clear to me that Uncharted 3 went through rewrites. Before I go on, I should say that the following is speculation. At one point during this game's development, I believe Talbot was supposed to be some kind of supernatural character, possibly some kind of djinn, which are mentioned later as the hidden secret of Ubar. It would explain both these instances perfectly, and why at the end of the game there seems to be a build towards some kind of boss that never really pays off. I don't know why this cut was made, only that it is a real shame elements of it are left over in the final game. The cutscenes were probably already mocapped and voiceovered, so a push was made to keep them. I would have preferred they'd been cut to preserve the integrity of the story, but that brings us back to how Naughty Dog may construct their games. Perhaps they wanted to keep the Cutter-Drake fight, which included many custom animations, so they had to keep the scene where he was dosed and told not to trust Drake. I don't know. I'm only guessing. I also guess that one reason Talbot was made into a normal human was to cool off on the supernatural elements in the games. Technically, Uncharted 3 has very few supernatural elements in comparison to Uncharted 2. One could view the spiders as some kind of supernatural guardians of the road to Ubar, and there's a perpetual sandstorm surrounding the city. The rest is left up to the imagination. Drake sees Jinn, but it's a sequence where he is drugged out of his mind, technically not supernatural. We are never given a confirmation if the Jinn in the jar at the end of the game are real, so it is only implied. This leaves Uncharted 3 with less supernatural stuff than both Uncharted 1 and Uncharted 2, which, if Uncharted 4 is any indication, is the direction Naughty Dog wanted to push the series. Talbot being some kind of mystical Jinn would have been going in the opposite direction. But whether all that is true or not, what we are left with is a mess of a story. A story with too many subplots that are poorly executed, a game with too many plot holes, a game that doesn't really have a cohesive arc, and overall one that just fails to deliver on what Naughty Dog has done very well in the past. And let me be clear, Uncharted 2 is not the pinnacle of storytelling, but it is a cohesive whole. I just can't say the same for Uncharted 3. Now let us return to where we left off. Like I said, narratively this part doesn't matter, but it does do some things right. These are some of the best combat arenas in this game, especially this one here with 2 mounted guns and several soldiers. There are a number of routes you can take here, and it is satisfying to be able to manage this entire battlefield. At any time you can take an emergency dive underwater to dodge some bullets and recover health too. I wish though that the game actually had swimming controls instead of a weird hold button to temporarily dive that Nate does. Climbing here is also quite spectacular. The camera will even pan away for some moments, allowing you to take in the landscape. There once again is another vertical combat section here that also changes up the normal gameplay. Eventually a storm brews and Nate must battle around this dock, experiencing heavy waves before boarding a boat to Ramsey's cruise ship. Eventually you get onto the cruise ship and it's pretty spectacular. Watching the water slush around this pool can be mesmerizing. The fights on the ship are fairly good as well, and I easily think they could have had way more fun with this concept. Like I said before, Drake goes down to the hold, finds fake Sully, and then proceeds to do something stupid and starts sinking the ship. This leads to a spectacular sequence where Drake must escape from the sinking vessel. Unfortunately, a couple absurd things happen here. 1. Drake does one of the dumbest things I've ever seen a human being do by boarding this elevator here. 2. There are enemies shooting you. While the ship is going down, and while they are in an imminent danger, they are busy shooting you. And this will bring me to my second biggest problem with Uncharted 3 after story. I'll simply call this one enemies and the environment. Unlike prior Uncharted games, we are faced here with 2 different groups of enemies. We have Marlowe's men, and we have the pirates. From our limited understanding of the context given around Marlowe's band of soldiers, we can surmise that they are well funded and have access to top-level tools and weaponry. So, it's not totally game-breaking to see them in full armor or wielding RPGs and sniper rifles. One might expect then that the pirates would behave completely differently. They would not have the same resources, and thus, this section in the ship graveyard and cruise ship would play completely differently. Unfortunately, the game severely disappoints here. The pirates behave no different from Marlowe's soldiers. In fact, there are no discernible differences at all. In this ship graveyard, we might have the following expectations: less soldiers, unarmored soldiers that focus more on parkour and traversal, and maybe worse weapons. But there's none of that. Nothing changes. This is made all the more glaring when you run into heavily armed soldiers on the cruise ship. Why? What purpose do they serve, and who are they expecting to need all this heavy equipment for? The pirates not only dress the same, but behave the same as well. Despite completely different loyalties and lives, there is no discernible difference in how they act. One might expect Marlowe's men to be stupidly loyal as member of this weird organization, but I'd hesitate to say the same for the pirates. If anything, they should be more out for themselves. There is no indication of that, however. In fact, the worst is when the ship begins to sink and there are still pirates trying to kill you. At that point, wouldn't it be way more interesting if they stopped trying to kill you and just tried to escape? Maybe you even help each other. But the human enemies in Uncharted rarely behave like humans, and it's especially obvious when they show the zero regard for their own self-preservation. Earlier in the game in France, there are people who take the time to come and kill you in the burning chateau instead of getting out and letting the flames do the work. Or later on, when the plane begins to crash, instead of ensuring his own safety, this guy is busy shooting you, as if Drake were somehow a threat in this situation. In this way, enemies in Uncharted and the surrounding environment rarely show any synergy. Enemies will almost never react to surrounding circumstances in any understandable way, and even blatantly ignore environmental factors. There is a scene later in the desert where an enemy is wearing full body armor. It's just a ridiculous sight. That person would be melting. Later on, there is an arena in a sandstorm that obstructs Drake's vision, but the enemies have no difficulty, shooting at your exact position from across the map. This is all to the following point. Naughty Dog have put great care in many aspects of their game design. The way everything animates, the attention to detail in the levels, the visuals, and the architecture, and so much more, but completely drop the ball when it comes to creating convincing enemies. In any other game, I'm not sure it would matter nearly as much, but in Uncharted to have mindless mob enemies can be a glaring flaw. This also includes the issues of how too many enemies flood an arena from nowhere, no context given to how they can spawn in when there really shouldn't be any enemies. This was an issue in Uncharted 1, much less in Uncharted 2, but it's back in full force for Uncharted 3. There is something to be said for narrative cohesion, and these issues with enemies further break the game world to service the combat. Your tolerance of these problems will vary. You may not care or notice and move joyfully along, or it might be enough to put down the controller. The cutscenes in Uncharted 3 are well crafted, no arguments there, but when the gameplay between them is full of holes, it becomes harder to appreciate the narrative construct. That's my last long aside until we reach the end of the game, so let's continue talking through the story now. Drake somehow finds Elena's apartment and they make a plan to rescue Sully. This will take Elena and Nate to an airfield to board a plane. It's fairly simple fights here, but I want to point out this one because Nate begins this by saying,
Too many. We just have to get through here as quietly as possible.
So naturally I took that as a cue to try stealth through the encounter. I got all the way to the end, tried to exit the arena, and Elena simply falls dead. Moving on, Nate ditches Elena out of concern for her own safety. He tries to board the plane but is blocked, and it's at this part where you may or may not notice the inherent problem with always hit weapons. Nate is absolutely destroyed here before I can even get anywhere. Eventually Nate runs after the plane and Elena shows up to give him a lift. Nate grabs onto the wheel as it rises and the plane takes off, entering us into one of the most spectacular set pieces of the Uncharted games. Long story short, Nate is almost thrown out of the plane, but decides his best course of action is to activate a parachute on one of the containers, which causes a chain reaction that will eventually take down the plane. It's once again incredibly impressive both technically and visually. Definitely one of the best sequences in the series as Nate is holding on for dear life thousands of feet in the air. Nate manages to grab a hold of a container and floats it down to the ground. The plane crashes and we see the horrible thing Nate just did and doesn't care. Worse, he's about to start walking through the desert. A desert that's at least 260,000 square miles without any knowledge of the direction he should take. Dumber still, he leaves all the supplies from the plane behind and just goes out in the desert without any water. It's just eye-rolling stupid. I know the games play it fast and loose with how capable Nate is and how realistic they want things to be, but the game also draws attention to this later with the fact that Nate is thirsty, so it's hard for us to ignore it. What happens next you'll either love or hate. Nate walks through the dunes of the desert while the music swells in the background. It's once again very beautiful, majestically shot, and I especially like that even though we cut in and out of different scenes, Drake's footsteps in the sand remain consistent. After several days of hiking through the desert, mirages, and illusions, Nate comes upon some kind of settlement which may or may not have water for him. Instead, it's a combat arena. Now, I'm not expecting Drake to suddenly fight like he's been wandering in the desert for a couple days, but the amount of enemies thrown at you here is staggering. It's hard to keep that suspension of disbelief in place. Marlowe's men are here, also, for no reason. Drake says something like they are looking for the plane, but that makes no sense. It's just an excuse to have combat, and I also view this segment of the game until we are saved by Salim to be more non-connective filler. The fights here are standard fare, enjoyable, but it's hard to see why Nathan is fighting these guys. Also, he doesn't try to pick the water off of them. It can sometimes seem like when it's combat's turn to shine, the story and setting have to take a back seat. Drake is saved by a late added character, Salim, who, much like Schaefer from Uncharted 2, has very little to do with the story, and only provides a means to get Drake from the desert to back on track. After staying a night, Nate sets out on horseback and tries to catch up with Marlowe's convoy. This is the second iteration of a set piece we saw in Uncharted 2, and it happens roughly at the same point in each game. You'll be jumping from truck to truck, taking out enemies and attempting to get to the front of the convoy to save Sully. This is wonderfully implemented, mostly because of how free-form it can feel. For the most part, there are many routes you can take here. Use the truck as cover to take out enemies, or just stay on horseback the whole time and charge. It feels frantic yet free-form, and it's superbly done. Especially since being on horseback feels great. It all ends as you catch up to Sully and rescue him from the clutches of the bad guys. Nate and Sullivan share a tearful reunion, and you can see how much they mean to each other. This is what I meant when I said that this is the only subplot that really worked for me. Salim insists they must not let Marlowe's organization reach the city, so they continue off until reaching a dust storm where they lose Salim. They do find more of Marlowe's men and engage in another combat section. This one is unfortunately marred by the fact that the storm has no effect on the enemies. It's really a shame because I think otherwise this is one of the better arenas, with 2 turret trucks to try to take out in the middle and many sniper enemies. Finally, Sully and Drake reach the gates of the city, and after a short climbing section the doors open and we can see the city in all its glory. Like Shambhala in Uncharted 2, this is a great visual payoff. Ubar looks wonderful and detailed, and of course, eerily empty. Unfortunately, also like Uncharted 2, there is no quiet in the city to be had, so it's hard to appreciate. Nate and Sully find a fountain which Drake drinks from, and then a solar eclipse happens and Sullivan is shot by Talbot. This is the game's next acid trip segment, though it's not something immediately obvious. You aren't supposed to notice until a bit later. This is all supposed to be real. The enemies in the next area are supposed to be the Jinn described to Nate earlier by Salim. They are enemies that can teleport around, but otherwise function the same as other baddies. They work well to change up the combat, but I think I would have liked that instead of guns they used fire or some other method to harm Drake. They also have phases instead of normal health bars, and I think it would have been slightly more interesting to have them a bit more difficult to kill. Maybe some can even reanimate after dying or something. Nate goes on his acid trip for a while, and Naughty Dog clearly had fun with this, transforming Nate into his younger self and throwing the deadly spiders into places they don't belong. It all ends when Nate's reflection grabs him. I really like this part, nothing more to say there. Drake awakens in an empty pool surrounded by corpses, his trip supposedly over. He is now under the city and finds Marlowe's men and shoots them down. I just want to bring this up once again, how heavily armored these soldiers are, despite the fact that there is no resistance encountered here. The only person fighting back is Drake, yet they have an army ready to fight down here. To compare back with Uncharted 2, Lazarevic had a reason for having his heavily armed troops in the city. There was a hostile force combating them. Uncharted 3 lacks that context, but I'll stop harping on it. Drake turns a corner and discovers Sully, and is understandably very confused. This leads to the revelation that the water is tainted with some kind of hallucinogenic agent, and Drake unintentionally took it, which causes visions of the eclipse, Sully's death, and the Djinn.
How do I know you're real?
Ow!
That real enough for you?
I love this twist because it makes complete sense and gives the excuse to have supernatural elements without them being real. Reunited, Sully and Drake fight through a few more enemies before coming upon Marlowe and Talbot raising a jar that supposedly houses the evil spirits of the city from the water. This is supposedly the source of the water tainting, and it's what Marlowe is really after, the ability to control her enemies using it. It's a fine story and a good payoff. We even get to see the jar, but it's never opened, which may or may not disappoint you. Just before though, Sully grabs what looks to be a pistol, and this is the last Deus Ex Machina of the game. This magic pistol shoots not one, not two, but 3 missiles. Not only capable of firing underwater, but has enough explosive impact to destroy a column which causes the collapse of the entire city. It's ridiculous, and I cannot believe it made it into the script. But whatever at this point. Sully falls into the water, Nate jumps in after him. They shoot the crane hoisting the Djinn jar, and the city begins to crumble. Drake and Sully must fight their way out, and this is the last occurrence of enemies that have no regard for their own well-being. They even say so.
Oh my god, the city's collapsing! I have to get out of here!
And then they proceed to focus on killing Nate and Sully. Eventually you come upon Marlowe, who's about to be sucked into some quicksand. Nate rightfully hesitates before trying to save her.
Earn this, as Francis earned it from Elizabeth. Prove your greatness!
I got nothing to prove.
Hurry! Give me a hand! You can't just let her die! The hell he can't! Nate, give me your goddamn hand! Here! Grab it! What the hell are you doing?
I can't.
It's no good! Get the hell out of there! Hold on!
Honestly, I know this isn't the Uncharted style at all, but I would have loved if I, the player, was able to make this decision. Perhaps a quick time event where you try to save her. Like I said, it's not the Uncharted style, so I won't say any more. She gets sucked in, and Sully and Drake resume escaping. They run into a distressed Talbot, and this is the pseudo-boss fight with your rival. To be fair, there's quite a lot of work in the game making Drake and Talbot into rivals. They both share several traits. But this fight doesn't last long enough to be the conclusion anyone was hoping for. Nathan is able to shoot him just in time, and he and Sully escape the sinking city thanks to Salim. There's a short epilogue in which Sully says a few words to Nate, which inspires him, apparently, to reconcile with Elena.
Stop. Just stop being a wise ass for 1 second.
How long you been carrying that around?
Too long.
Thought I'd lost it.
Here's the thing, kid. We don't get to choose how we start in this life. Real greatness, it's what you do with the hand you're dealt.
This is how the past two games have ended, so I'm not sure if we're supposed to expect this to pan out. I definitely think this subplot should have been in the game, but given far more screen time. Maybe Elena and Drake should have done the ship graveyard sequence together. Everything ends, more or less, happily ever after. So that's Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception, and for me it's a very mixed bag. The problems I have with it are real, and for some reason, far more obvious in this game than in Uncharted 2. I stand by my critique of Uncharted 2. I gushed about the game a great deal, but I think it's deserving of all the praise. I didn't find many glaring faults in the game. Uncharted 3's faults are obvious ones. Even if I glance over some of them, elements like Talbot and the cruise ship non sequitur are sure to hit you square in the face. I will echo what I said earlier. I think Uncharted 3's story is a mess, but I think it's a mess in many other aspects as well. It's not just the story. I understand that problems arise during development, and we know now that Naughty Dog would be undergoing some leadership change-ups shortly after this game released, so maybe that's the reason. Or maybe this game was rushed, or Naughty Dog just built the game the wrong way, starting with set pieces before forming a coherent story. I don't know, and perhaps never will, but my point is this. Naughty Dog have achieved something unique in the Uncharted series. It's not just a dumb action flick, it's characters and a story we have grown to enjoy. This makes it all the worse when development decisions seem to service other aspects of the game in blatant disregard for the narrative. I feel like these decisions are all over on Uncharted 3, and for that reason I don't find this game to be as good as Uncharted 2. Before playing this game for critique, I more or less considered them to be on par with each other, but I cannot ignore Uncharted 3's faults. I don't think this game is bad. It certainly is far better than Uncharted 1, and I still enjoy many parts of the game. It's probably the most visually interesting Uncharted so far, and has many memorable moments. The problems are in the connective tissue, and it's unfortunate because had they delayed the game to fix them, I do believe it would be on par with Uncharted 2, perhaps even better. For now, Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception is a slight regression, has some major issues, but it's still a fairly enjoyable romp. In the next video, I'll be talking about Uncharted 4 Thief's End, finally off the PS3 and onto the PS4, the first game post The Last of Us. Backwards Compatible is a video series looking back at older games in long form, one of many kinds of videos I hope to do on my channel. If you enjoy it, I hope you'll like, subscribe, follow me on Twitter at Mishakos, and support me on Patreon at patreon.com/Mishakos. For $1 and up, you get Backwards Compatible early. Thanks everyone and have a wonderful day.